The country up around our ranch was certainly not anything like this country. It was either flat or undulating, and it had a lot of beautiful playa lakes on it every time it would rain. And when it did, we'd hear the curlews, which had a plaintive call, which you could hear. And if I by accident hear a curlew, they're almost extinct in this part of the world. I'll never forget that plaintive call that the curlew have. It's a long-legged, rather pretty good-sized bird that has a long curved beak, and they waded out in those playa lakes to eat. And then also at night we had lots of coyotes, and as soon as it got dark, those coyotes would start to howl back and forth to each other, and it's a sound that a lot of people don't like, but I love to hear those coyotes howl, and it was wonderful to go to sleep to hear them howling at night. And we had other wildlife too, with lots of prairie dogs. And my mother used to let us sit on the running boards, or stand on the running board, or sit on the fenders, and people had fenders that time that covered their tires. And she'd get out on the prairie and chase badgers. And she never was able to go very fast, and she never did really try to hit one. But she enjoyed seeing them run in front of the car, which they did. And there were also lots of rattlesnakes. And I'll never forget I went barefooted most of the time. We had a man, he was out hunting rabbits one day. And I was going along looking up at the sky, singing, and looked down, and I'd almost put my foot right down into a coiled rattlesnake. And I started screaming and yelling and couldn't move, just stood there with my foot up in the air. And the man's name was Robert Cummings turned around and shot that rattlesnake from underneath my foot. But we cut off the rattles, and I think it had about 20 rattles. And the rattles were supposed to indicate the age of the snake. They got a new rattle every year. I don't think any of us ever did get bitten by a snake. I don't recall that we did, but they were there. And also lots of jackrabbits. And I don't see a jackrabbit anymore. They're almost gone in this part of the world. But it was pretty primitive. But I've told about driving up there before. We could sit on our front porch and see a mesa in the distance. It was over in New Mexico called Rabbit Ear. And when we were driving up here and Rabbit Ear would begin to come into view, we'd all start yelling, "I see Rabbit Ear!" And somebody said, "Now you know you didn't, I saw it first." We never did decide who got to see Rabbit Ear first. But I never could figure out why Rabbit Ear looked like a rabbit ear, because it didn't to me. And I didn't know until I was grown and read about it that Rabbit Ear was the name of a famous Comanche chief who lived out in that part of the world. And that was really, all of that part of Texas was Comanche country. And it was a wonderful, wonderful thing for a child, an atmosphere for a child to grow up in and hear all those stories. You asked me one time what we did for fun, and I forgot to tell you about the old mare that we all loved named Baldy. And Baldy, we'd go get Baldy and bring her up and put a bridle on her, but no saddle. And maybe 3 or 4 of us would get on Baldy to ride. And Baldy would start around the house in a circle. She'd go start, and there was a big apple tree out in the back that had a low limb. And old Baldy, we couldn't guide her away from that limb to save our life. And she would go to the low limb and wipe us all off of her rear end, and we'd all go off on the ground. And then she'd get on the other side and stop, and we'd all get on, start around the house again. Come around the house, and Baldy would wipe us all off, stop for us all to get on. We'd get on, and she'd come around and do it. And we would do that for the hour. And I remember time, she was a good, placid old horse and a good riding horse. And I remember one time Aunt Johnny was visiting up there, and she put a saddle on Baldy, and I sat in front of Aunt Johnny in that saddle, and we all rode. There were other horses and people. We all rode over to Buffalo Springs, where there was the springs. Naturally, that's why it was named Buffalo Springs, and had a picnic, and that was fun. And there were a lot of mounds around there with stones around them that we always guessed. We never dug any of them up, but we always guessed that perhaps those were Indian graves. We did not know for sure, but they could have been. We never did have any antelope, or pronghorns they call them, rather than antelope. We used to call them antelope, but they are pronghorns. And if they had some on our ranch, we never did see them. They were very shy back in those days. But now you do get to see the pronghorns on some of the big ranches up there.
Tell us about some of the people who worked out there that you remember.
Well, when I first went up there, the ranch foreman was a man named Alexander, and I really don't remember them too well, and I don't remember their names, because I really was just a little girl. We quit going there when I was 6 or 7 years old. I mean, on a regular basis in the summertime. So I don't remember them. I remember after we left, Daddy bought some people named Newman up there who had given him a job when he was a little boy. There were two of them, Bill Newman and his sister Anna, and they were characters if there ever came down the pike. They were brother and sister. Bill had a great big floppy mustache that hung down over his lips, and he used to strain his soup and his coffee through that mustache. And Aunt Anna probably weighed close to 300 pounds at least. And she wore high-top tennis shoes and a great big moo-moo. And she made biscuits that were about the size of a saucer. And fried ham and all of this stuff that was due to give you cholesterol until you just nearly die. But they really were not ranchers. They were tenant farmers, and that's where they really didn't know too much about ranching. But they had been good to Daddy when he was a little boy, and he wanted to be good to them. Now, Bill had a younger brother, and I'm not sure what that man, his name was also Newman, and he had 3 or 4 children. And so they also came up there and worked on the ranch. But I don't remember the names of any of the cowboys. I remember some of the funny things that happened with the animals. We had a big old sow one time that had about 11 piglets. And I was over at the barn sitting up on the fence looking at those new piglets, and I fell off in the pen. Well, that old sow came after me. They're very, very protective, and they can also be very dangerous. If that old sow could have caught me, she could have really hurt me. But I really made tracks and got out of that pen in a big hurry. And then I remember one time Mother and Daddy was going to butcher a calf. And they had put the calf in the barn to fatten it. And I'd go down every day and look at that calf. And I became very fond of the calf. And the day before they were to butcher it, I knew they were going to butcher it because I heard them talking about it. Mother and Daddy were going to Texline, and Daddy was up there visiting Wichita Falls. And I was too sick to go. Well, anytime I was too sick to leave the ranch, Mother knew I was sick. And I was ashamed to tell her what it was. And it wasn't a thing in the world except I was just sick at my stomach at the very thought of their killing that little calf. I couldn't stand the thought of it. And those are just some of the memories that come and go from the ranch.
Now, Grandpa Morgan owned some other farms you had mentioned earlier.
That's right.
Where were those?
Down by Lockney. He had 2 down there. And there again, the Newmans ran those farms for him. Bill and Anna were on one farm, and his brother, wish I could think of that man's name. Anyway, he and his wife and children were on the other farm down there. And as usual, Daddy, with his good business sense, kept those farms, and they were not money makers. And he got rid of them just before they started putting in deep wells in that part of the world down there, and those farmers ended up multimillionaires. So we would also go down there with him to those farms. I had farming and ranching experience there, and then later on I had farming and ranching experience with Dr. Rasco after I married into that family. But that's another story. When I was 13 years old, I walked into my algebra class one day early, and I was the only student in the room, and my teacher, Esther Schreiber, said, "I know who you're going to marry." And I thought, what under the sun is she talking about? I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well," she said, "David Rasco has spotted you and has gone home and told his mother he's seen the girl he was going to marry." And I said, "Who is David Rasco?" And she said, "He's that funny looking little boy, that skinny little boy that sits behind you in algebra. And I've known him since he was born, and once he makes a statement, he never changes his mind. So chances are you're going to end up by marrying David." Well, for 2 years, I would see David Rasco in the hall, and he would barely nod and barely speak to me. But he was the subject of a lot of practical jokes from some mutual friends of ours who would call him up on the phone and tell him that it was I, and that I needed a ride to go someplace. Well, David was about the only kid in high school I knew who had a car. And he had a wonderful Kelly Green Model A Ford. And as I say, the only kid I knew who had his own car. But he'd be looking forward to coming picking me up someplace, and then maybe one of the mothers of Jane Monning or Ellen Upfries or Ben Monning or some of these kids who were teasing him would call him up and say, "David, that's a practical joke." And they were afraid that if he came to pick me up, that my father would just eat him up alive. Of course, he wouldn't have. He didn't even know him. He called him Sonny until we got married almost. But at any rate, for 2 years, I didn't have a date with David. And then a friend of mine, Evelyn Storm, had a couples party. And she asked me who I would like to have bring me. And I said, "Well, why don't you ask David Rasco to bring me, because I understand I'm going to marry him, and I don't think he's ever even spoken to me yet." So she called him up and had him pick me up. Well, there again, he was so shy he could hardly speak to me. And Jane Monning, who was one of my best friends and who had known David since he was a little boy, had me pull this stunt on him. And David had rather an outsized nose, and it was especially noticeable on a 15-year-old kid. So one night we were the three of us were all sitting at this party, and he was afraid to dance. So we were just visiting, and Jane said, "Mary Tom, why don't you tell David he looks just like Jimmy Durante?" So that's what I did, and we giggled and carried on. Well, of course, he was just crushed. And I'm surprised he ever asked me out again. And he didn't for the longest time, but just occasionally he would call me up and ask me to go to the picture show. Well, by the time we were juniors in high school, we had what might have been an arrangement. Nobody went steady back in those days. But we had an unspoken agreement that he would pick me up every 2 weeks, and we'd go to the picture show. Well, he was still scared of Daddy, who was a great big 6 feet 2 1/2 man, and afraid if he called me to break the date, he'd get a daddy on the telephone. And I tried to tell him that my father never answered the telephone, that at his office he had a secretary to do it, and at home with 4 kids, he certainly never answered the telephone, so he never was going to get a hold of my father. But if for some reason he couldn't go or anything, he'd just stand me up. So I don't know why he was afraid to call me to make the date. Well, there again, some of his cute friends like Tall Ware, and I don't believe Tall was in on this, but Bob Garner and Pud Tollison and some of his friends would spot his car, not his car, but his mother's car at the movies. And his mother had what they called a Rio Flying Cloud, which is frequently listed these days as an antique automobile in the crossword puzzles. If you see a three-letter word in the crossword puzzles, it's going to be Rio. And I think it was the only Rio in town, so it was easily recognized. Well, these cute kids of his would come by and spot that car, and they'd stick potatoes in the exhaust pipe, so when he started it up, it would backfire, backfire, backfire. Or they'd tie Coke bottles or something to the bottom of it so they'd start dragging down the street. And they just made his life miserable. Well, one night I had a date with him, and David was not quite as tall as I was. And so he came in one night from a date, and after that date they lost the car keys. They couldn't find the car keys for months and months. Well, one day Ms. Rascal was coming down the stairs, and there was a mirror at the bottom of the stairs, and she happened to look in it, and there were the car keys on top of the door jamb, where David had come in and jumped up and caught hold of the door jamb to try to stretch himself to make himself taller. But he was still a little bit shorter than I was when we got married. Well, after we got out of high school, I had gone off every summer for the 3 summers to work at Chile Camp. And then after we got out of high school, David went to the University of Texas, and I went to to Stevens College in Columbia. Well, I never would hear from David. He wouldn't write, he wouldn't do anything, and then he'd wait until he thought I was so mad that he'd call me up long distance. And back in those days, that was in the Depression, and to call me up long distance was a pretty big expense. Well, the calls weren't as cheap then as they are now. Well, inevitably, I'd forgive him. But I was there 2 years, and David was at the University of Texas 2 years. Well, the next year I transferred to the University of Texas, and David transferred to Northwestern University, which had a wonderful journalism school. That was kind of funny because by that time my parents had moved to Evanston, Illinois, which was just a few blocks from Northwestern University. But of course I was in Texas by that time, and David was in Illinois. Well, David was still kind of a slight young man, but he moved into the Phi house at Northwestern, and the boys at the Phi house absolutely adored David because he was different. He was from Texas. But the thing about it was all those boys up there were big intramural wrestlers and intramural and football players for Northwestern, and great big old hunks, and here was little old skinny David. Well, he'd come in, and they'd pick him up and do a airplane twirl or something with one of their wrestling maneuvers, or they'd tackle him or something. And by this time, they'd made him president of the chapter. But when they would do that, David would say, "You better watch out. If you don't quit doing that, I want to get my girl up here from Texas to take care of you." Well, they didn't have any idea what kind of a girl he had from Texas. It sounded like I was a big hunk myself. Well, he got his comeuppance one night when he went to a Kappa dinner and sat next to this girl from Omaha, and I don't remember her name, but she noticed his accent and she asked him where he was from, and he said, I'm from Amarillo, Texas. Well, all of his fraternity brothers were listening to who were sitting around were listening to this conversation, and she said, oh, I used to know a girl from Amarillo at a camp out in Colorado, and said she wore her hair in a boyish haircut, and I'd gotten mad at David one time and cut my hair off into a boyish haircut, which nobody did in those days. And she said, I used to know her, and she was the most peculiar girl I ever knew. And David, instead of keeping his mouth shut, said, I certainly do know her. She's the girl I'm going to marry. But I don't think he ever told those football players or anybody else that I was going to take care of them. Well, the next year, while he was still at Northwestern, I transferred to the University of Wisconsin, which was 125 miles from Evanston, where my folks live and where Northwestern University was. So I came home frequently to the fireside dances and things. And the football players and the wrestlers got to meet me, and they were very, very nice to me. And if they would come up to the University of Wisconsin on exchange intramural things, they'd call me on the phone and say, Mary Tom, I have a railroad ticket back to Evanston, and I'd like to stay in Madison over the weekend, so why don't you use my ticket to go back down to Evanston to see David for the weekend? I said, just don't let the coach catch you that I'm using a Northwestern University ticket. So I got to see David quite a bit when I was at the University of Wisconsin. And he would drive up to see me for some of our school dances. And our house mother at the Theta House grew very fond of David. So when he would come up there, she'd let him stay down in the basement where the boys who worked in the kitchen and were the waiters in the Theta House had an extra bed down there, so she'd let him stay at the sorority house. Well, David graduated, came on home, and got a job at the newspaper. And he had started working at the newspaper in the summertime when he was 13 years old and worked for nothing. And the next summer, he came back, and I think they paid him $5 a week for the summer. Well, by the time we got married, he had 13 years experience working for the newspaper. By this time he was 23, 13 years experience and a master's degree in journalism, and his salary had risen to $17 a week. Well, he didn't think that he could support me in the style to which I was accustomed on $17 a week, so he would not even consider getting married. And in the meantime, I had gotten a job teaching school in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, and I was making $125 a month. But I was going to have to leave that job if I came back to Texas. Well, one day I was in the basement doing the laundry in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, and my landlady called down and she said, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. So all I could think about, she said, we'll probably go to war. So when I came back upstairs, the first thing I did was call David and said, David, we're going to go to war, so let's get married. And he did agree to get married. Well, David had joined the Navy. He knew he was going. That's when the young men were getting drafted. And he knew that he was going to get drafted. This was December the 7th, of course, 1941, and Europe had been at war several years by this time. So he did not want to be what he called a foot soldier. So he had joined the Navy in October, but he had not been called yet. Well, one of his beats on his newspaper route was the recruiting officer, Chief Norman of the Navy Recruiting Office. So when Pearl Harbor hit, this old con man, who had been in the Navy all of his life, except for 3 years in the Mississippi State Highway Patrol in the 30s, He couldn't even type. So he called David and he said, "David, get over here, you're in the Navy." Well, David was so dumb, he didn't know the old chief petty officer couldn't put him in the Navy. So he went over and the chief swore him into office, made him gave him his rank, made him a second-class yeoman, and put him to work. And David worked for him. We got about a month, and we did agree to he did agree to marry me, and we got married before he was called into the Navy. Got official papers to be sworn into the Navy. But in the meantime, we did decide to get married. My parents were going to be married at Polk Street Methodist Church, which was the church that David and I both had grown up in, and the church that my mother and father had been very active. So we were going to marry Christmas Eve. So my family, who lived in Evanston, and my sister Sally and John, all agreed to come to Amarillo and ruin their Christmas so we could be married on Christmas Eve. Well, unbeknownst to us, my future mother-in-law, we were going to have a small family wedding in the chapel of the church because the war was on and my parents were not here. And then they were going to have a reception out at the country club for the people who were not invited to the wedding. Well, unbeknownst to us, my bossy mother-in-law and her daughter had gotten on the phone and had called everybody they knew to come to this wedding. Well, a week before that, my friend Jane Monning, who was arranging for the flowers and other things, called me and said, "Mary Tom, the Rascos have invited everybody they know to this wedding and the chapel is not going to hold them." But it was too late to get the church, too late to get the chapel, to cancel the chapel. And so I said, "Well, just call some of my mother's friends that you can think of and tell them to come because they're going to be offended if they're not invited, if the Rascos invited everybody." And another thing Ms. Rasco did was to call the country club and cancel the reception without telling my mother she'd done it. And here my mother had had all these beautiful wedding announcements printed up, which were not appropriate to send. She carried those wedding announcements around, and I had them for years and years and years and used them to write on the back to keep score for bridge games. But nevertheless, that's the way it was. Sam, my younger brother Sam, who had a beautiful singing voice, had agreed to sing. Well, when he heard that many people were coming, he said he wouldn't do it. So we got a man who was sang in the choir at Polk Street Methodist Church to agree to sing, but he was also an ambulance driver. So about 2 hours before the wedding, he called up and he said, "I'm going to have to cancel my appointment because there's been a bad wreck out on the Canyon Highway, and I'll have to go out and pick up the wounded and the people who are dead." And he said, "By the time I get back to town, it'll be too late for me to change my clothes to get and sing." Well, that was just another thing that happened. Well, we got to the church, and I was supposed to have a small white orchid because my dress that I had bought was a brown dress with a brown sequin top that I could use for other occasions rather than a traditional wedding dress. But I had no place to put a big corsage on it. So I was going to carry a small white orchid on my purse. Well, when I got over there, here was this box with a great big purple orchid on it and no place to put it. And it was just a fiasco. And my friend Carly McKnight was going to play the organ. Well, everybody got there, and all the people who were invited to the church couldn't get in that chapel, so they were standing outside. Fortunately, it was a beautiful, warm, sunny day in December. Hard to believe. but it was in his high 70s. Well, Carly began to play the organ, and she played, and she played, and she played, and no groom. Well, finally the groom arrived 45 minutes late. And what had happened, he had lost the marriage license. And he had put it under the dining room rug for safekeeping and had forgotten where it was. So not only David was late for the wedding, everybody in his family was late to the wedding because they were all searching the house over for that marriage license, which we had to have for the preacher to sign. So finally, he walked through the dining room and it dawned on him where that marriage license was, under the dining room rug. So he finally got there. Well, by that time, my family were nervous wrecks. I was a nervous wreck. Couldn't imagine what in heaven's name had happened to the groom, with all these people standing outside waiting for the ceremony to start. And then when it was over, Ms. Rasco had decided to have cake and coffee at her house instead of the reception that my mother, well, again, that many people couldn't get in the house, so they were lined up outside in a long line to come through the receiving line to get in at the house. So it took about an hour and a half or more for everybody to get in. And by that time, I can't even remember what had happened to my folks. I think they had left and gone out to dinner someplace. They weren't there anymore. But David and I had been given Rip Underwood's apartment. And Rip was a good family friend who had a bachelor apartment at the Talmadge, which was right across the alley from where the Rascos lived. And so that's where we were to go after the reception. Well, after the reception, Ms. Rasco said, Sonny hadn't had anything to eat for breakfast, so I'm going to cook him pork chops before you all leave. Well, by that time, I was worn out and exhausted, so I took my shoes off and stretched out on the couch, and David went over and got in an easy chair and picked up one of Peggy LeClaire's, his niece who was Peggy LeClaire, picked up her funny book to read while Mammy, we called her Mammy at that, I called her Ms. Rasco, cooked pork chops, which as you know have to be cooked well done. David was sitting over there reading Superman. Well, by the time Sonny got fed, it was 9:30, and we still hadn't gotten away from his mother. Well, as we walked out the back door to walk across the alley to the Talmadge, Ms. Rasco leaned out the back door and said, Mary Tom, I never wanted Sonny to marry you. You aren't smart enough for him. So that was my introduction into the family. Dr. Rasco was a funny little man who always had an unlit cigar in his mouth. He didn't wear his teeth either, so his mouth kind of went in, and this cigar. Well, the first time I'd ever been around him, I'd been invited for dinner over there, and Ms. Rasco came to the door and she said, now, doctor, entertain Tommy. She called me Tommy about half the time. Entertain Tommy while I send David on an errand. Well, Dr. Rasco was sitting there in the chair, and he looked up at her and he said, Willie, I haven't said anything for 50 years. They'd been married 50 years. He said, I haven't said anything for 50 years. I don't know what to say. Well, of course, the war came along, and one of the other embarrassing things that happened to me that nobody knew about for years and years and years was when David was, I guess the old chief forged some letters or something to keep David there for a while because the war was going on full blast. Well, one day the old chief called me and he said, Mary Tom, he said, I understand you sew a little bit. And I said, well, I sew a little bit, Chief. What do you want? And he said, well, he said, I want you to make the Globe News a Navy E. Well, the Navy E was a flag that had an E. It was a navy blue flag that had a navy E embossed on both sides. And it was one that was given to Kaiser for building the Liberty ships, and General Motors for doing something special for the Navy, and so on and so forth. But the chief decided that the Globe News had been so good to him, he wanted to give them a Navy E. So he brought me the material, and I very painstakingly appliqued these E's on both sides so they'd match, and he went trotting over to the newspaper. Well, Mr. Howe was as dumb as David. So here came headlines, 2 inches high. Globe News wins Navy E. And the paper went to Washington, D.C. And the congressman, who was Gene Worley at that time, called back down and he said, Mr. Howe, he said, what do you mean the Globe News wins the Navy E? And Mr. Howe said, well, he said, we know that it's an honor. He said, the chief wanted us to have that Navy E because we were so good to him, and he said, we're going to have a big banquet so he can officially give it to us. And the congressman said, Mr. Howe, I think you better cancel that banquet. He said, the Navy E is given to people like Kaiser for building the Liberty ships and General Motors. And he said, it's given to them after it's, by the Secretary of the Navy, after it's been approved by Congress. And he said, I don't think any chief petty officer can give you the Navy E. I didn't tell anybody for 40 years that I'd made that Navy E. Well, the chief got to go to South Pacific in about 10 days. He had been dying to go, and he got to go. Well, that gave David the opportunity to apply for midshipman school. And if he had only known, he could have applied for a direct commission with a master's degree in journalism and probably be put in the public relations department of the Navy with a master's degree in journalism. But instead, he applied for midshipman school and went first to indoctrination at Notre Dame, and then went to Abbott Hall again in Chicago. And by this time I was pregnant. Well, David was and living in New York City, and I would spend 6 months in New York City and 6 months in Amarillo.
If I can interject, Grandma, how did you get to New York City?
Oh, well, that's when Daddy had started working for Texaco and their offices. He was a consulting attorney for Texaco, and I'll tell that story on another tape. He was a consulting for Texaco, and that's why they were living in New York City. They had moved from Evanston to New York City because Texaco was embroiled in another antitrust suit.
Well, how did you guys get to New York City?
Well, I got to New York City because Mother and Daddy were living there, and David was thinking he was going to get sent to sea. Well, he was sent to sea, and it was rather sad in a way because he was first stationed at Port Arthur, Texas, it was clear across Texas from Amarillo, but nevertheless it would have been much more convenient for me to be in Texas to have that baby, which I could have had with Dr. Winsett delivering her for $75 and practically no hospital bill, instead of going to New York to have Sally, where we had arranged to get a cut rate at the doctor for $500 to deliver the baby. But nevertheless, that's where David was Port Arthur. And when I was there, I went to stay in Chicago, first with some friends of mine from the University of Wisconsin, and then I moved down to the Allerton Hotel, which was a woman's hotel about 3 blocks from Abbott Hall, where David was, and he was able to come over and visit with me an hour a day the whole time he was in graduate school there. And we came back to Amarillo. That's when they came back when they stationed him at Abbott Hall. And then I went back to New York City, where Mother and Daddy were, and had the baby in New York City. Well, David was at Abbott Hall, at Port Arthur, and when Sally was born, his commanding officer said that he could not come to New York City for her. He said, in the Navy, all that's necessary is the laying of the keel. It's not necessary for you to be there for the christening of the ship. So he said, David, well, fortunately, he went on leave. And the second in command called David in, and he said, David, I'm going to give you leave to go to New York City. So David got on that train, that southern train, had to go all the way through the South and then all the way up the coast, and he was unable to get a seat on that train, and he stood up all the way from Port Arthur, Texas to New York City. And when he came into the apartment house where we lived, Mother, who was also a practical joker, she said, I hadn't had the baby yet. She said, you stay back behind in the hall, because he was going to get there at 7 o'clock in the morning. He had wired us. And David came over in a taxi, came up, and came in, and Mother said, David, he put his suitcase down, and Mother said, guess what, David? You've had twin girls. Well, David just collapsed on his suitcase. He didn't know what to say. And Mother, when she saw how distraught he was, she said, David, that's a big lie. That's not true. The baby has not come yet. Well, we waited and waited and waited all week for that baby to come, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. He was running out of leave time. And so I called the doctor one day, and I said, hearing that castor oil would bring on delivery, called him and I said, Dr. Wing, can't you give me a big dose of castor oil? And he said, why, are you constipated? And I said, no. And he said, well, I've got news for you. If that baby's not ready to come, I could give you a gallon of castor oil, and it's not going to help. Well, just a few days before David was to leave and go back, I began to show signs that the baby was going to be delivered that day. Well, we went out to New York lying in, and David went with me, and we rocked in the chair, and we walked up and down the hall, and we did everything. No signs of any labor pains. Well, about 9 o'clock that night, the doctor had gone home, David had gone home, I'd gone back to bed, and all of a sudden I started into hard labor. Well, they called David to come back out there, and he came, and there were 3 women in labor and 2 women in 2 nurses. So they put David in to take care of me. And they said, now, Mr. Rasco, don't let her sit up. And the natural thing when you're in labor is to sit up. Well, he tried to hold me down, and I bit him, and I hit him, and I did everything else, trying to sit up. Well, they finally came in and they gave me some pills to help with the labor, the pain, but one of them I spat out and it went clear across the room. Well, finally at midnight, they took me up to the labor room, left David sitting downstairs. Well, by that time they'd gotten the doctor back over there, but they hadn't gotten the nurse anesthetist. So I was howling because I really was in hard labor. I was howling, and so Dr. Wing started giving me gas. Well, finally the nurse got there, and she said, Dr. Wing, you've got that gas mask going upside down, and that gas is all going up in your face. Well, of course, that didn't set too well with the doctor, and he ate her out for being so slow. And finally, without very much anesthetic at all, Sally was born. Well, when she came out, her head just came to a point in the top. And I said, what do I have? And the nurse said, you have a beautiful little girl with dimples. But all I could see was this pointed head. And when I was growing up, we used to have a circus sideshow that came to Amarillo with the fair, and there was a girl named Slitsy in the sideshow whose head went to a point. And Slitsy was feeble-minded, and that pointed head never had gone down. And I looked at Sally and I thought, a beautiful little girl with dimples, I've got a Slitsy. I was scared to death. Well, they brought Sally down. By that time, her head had gone back to where it was supposed to be shaped. But they brought her down and put her in the nursery, brought me back to my room, but nobody bothered to tell David she had been born. Well, at 6 o'clock that morning, Daddy called out to the hospital and got a hold of David, and he said, David, what is going on? And he said, I don't know, but something must have terrible happened. She's been in the delivery room for over 6 hours. Well, that poor thing had been sitting down there, and they had not told him that baby had come. Well, that was just really terrible. But back in those days, young mothers, I was not a charity patient. Charity patients, they kicked out right away. But I was not a charity patient, so they let me sit on the side of the bed when Sally was 10 days old. But neither would they let David go in the nursery to see the baby. He couldn't get around the baby. Well, his time to leave, and my mother went out there with him, and she prevailed upon the nurse. She said, let this young daddy at least hold that baby, because he's on leave, and he's got to leave and go back to Port Arthur, Texas. So the nurse did let him hold Sally. Well, we came back. David went back to Port Arthur, and then he was sent to New Orleans. Well, by this time, it was time for me. My 6 months in New York was up, so I got on the train with Sally and came all the way on the New York Central and then on the Santa Fe with Sally. And David was first in New Orleans, and we were able to go down there and have 2 weeks with him. But before we left to get on the train to go to New Orleans, unbeknownst to me, Sally had been the best baby you ever saw. She never cried. And on the train, I'd been able to give her a bottle and go to the diner and eat, and she would finish the bottle and go to sleep. And the porter knew where I was, of course, if he needed me, but she never cried the whole time we got to Amarillo. Didn't cry when we got down here. Well, the night before we were to go to New Orleans to see her daddy for a couple of weeks, unbeknownst to me, Ms. Rasco decided to clean her out. So she gave her a big dose of Castoria or syrup of Pepsin or milk of magnesia or something. I don't know what she gave her, and didn't tell me she'd done it. Well, the night before we were to leave, Sally cried all night on the train. The train was late. We didn't get out till midnight. Got off the train in Dallas, and Sally cut loose. And she messed me up, all my clothes, all her clothes, went all over her shoes, went in the railroad station. Well, fortunately, Margaret Dodson and her husband were stationed down there in the Army. And I was going to have a whole day in Dallas before I went on to New Orleans. So we were able to go out to Margaret and get cleaned up before we took the train for New Orleans. Well, we have to remember that the Panhandle of Texas is a relatively young country as far as the United States is concerned. And a lot of the land up here was Comanche land and Kiowa land. And the first man to come in and start ranching was a man named Colonel Goodnight, who had the first ranch down in the Paladura Canyon and south of Amarillo, out of Goodnight, Texas. Well, all of this land was up here, and the state of Texas sold a large section of it, encompassed 10 acres, 10 counties, to a Chicago syndicate to finance the building of the state capitol. And the ranch was called the XIT Ranch. Well, naturally, it was a very historic ranch, and it was the first ranch that the Gibbons came in here and Sanford, and it was the first ranch in the country that was completely surrounded by barbed wire, which also helped to break the ranch. That was very expensive. Well, the Chicago syndicate came down, and their original headquarters were at a place called Buffalo Springs, which is up northeast of Dalhart in Dallam County. And because of the cost to the state, that the state sold this syndicate to finance the building of the state capitol in Austin. Well, it cost so much that to build the state capitol that it broke the ranch, and they eventually had to start breaking off selling off sections of it. And my father bought 22.5 sections of the ranch, just 1.5 miles east of Buffalo Springs. So this part of the ranch that Daddy bought was very historic. And it had 3 big living quarters, a bunkhouse for the cowboys, and another house we lived in at first, and then a big 2-story house that the foreman of the ranch lived in the first summer that we went up there, the first 2 summers maybe. And then we moved to the big house for the summer. And the reason we went to the ranch was that we were living in Wichita Falls at that time, and Wichita Falls was terribly hot. And it's hard to believe, but I was a delicate baby and a delicate child, and the doctors didn't think that I could stand the summers in Wichita Falls. And so as soon as John and Sally got out of school, Mother would pack up the 4 kids, and we would drive to the ranch. Although it was just a little over 400 miles from Wichita Falls to the ranch, it took 2 full days to get up there. And I don't remember any of the open cars that we used to drive, but one of the early cars we had was a Franklin. And it seemed to me that car had a box thing in the back seat that held the battery that we sat on. And that could be wrong, but I don't know. And then we also had what they called a big luxury car called a Mormon. And the Mormon was made by Studebaker, and it was about the ugliest car I ever saw. But it was an expensive car, and I remember one time on part of the trip west of Channing that we got on this hill, I'm sure, to help the speed limit. And as we were going down, Daddy said, "Look, Mother, we're going 60 miles an hour." And I can remember Mother yelling, "Slow down, Daddy, you're going to kill us all." Well, that old car, those old cars were built just like tanks, and as I recall, most of them were taken and used for scrap metal during World War II because they were solid steel. And you cannot buy one now, even at the antique shows. You never see a Mormon. Well, when we got to we passed through Amarillo back in those days, and we always stopped at a place called the Palace of Sweets down on 6th Street. And the descendants of the Palace of Sweets were some of the early day Greeks who moved to Amarillo. And their descendants are still here and are good friends of mine. But Daddy always tried to stop so we could get something there. Well, one of the other things that always happened on the trip was it seemed like to me that practically half the time we had car trouble in Channing. And you couldn't get, Channing was a small little town, had one little shotgun hotel, but they had a mechanic, but you couldn't get the parts. And so we'd have to stop in Channing. We burned out a bearing one time, had to stop in Channing so they could send to Amarillo to get the part, where we had to spend the night. And we stayed in this old hotel, and I remember Mother was up all night long throwing shoes at the rats in that hotel because she was afraid they'd get up and bite one of the children. And then another thing that happened as we went on up, sometime we would turn at Perico and go over the back way into the ranch. And when we did, we had to drive over a dry creek bed. And every time we'd hit that, Daddy would say, "We've got to hurry and get across this because it's quicksand. And if we get caught in the quicksand, we'll get stuck." So I remember that vividly. I don't ever remember getting stuck. But when we got to the ranch, my mother always had a great big garden out in the back. And I remember one time she grew a watermelon, and I was just dying for that watermelon to get ripe. And I'd go out and thump the watermelon, and one day I decided it was ripe, and so I broke it off. And of course it wasn't, it was still green, and that ruined the watermelon. Daddy bought this land, and he paid, it was a little over 22,000 acres. And as well as I can learn, he paid $15 an acre for it, which was quite a bit of money back in those days. And of course he did it with borrowed money. But the reason he bought it was that he didn't really want to be a working rancher. He had to hire somebody to run it for him because he was a practicing attorney. But he had been raised on a farm, and he always loved the land, and he bought the ranch, and later on he bought some farms so that he would have but he moved away from Amarillo, and so it made it difficult to operate these farms. Besides that, he got people on both of them who had helped him out as a young man, and they were kind of sorry tenant farmers. They weren't ranchers. They didn't really know how to ranch. And so it was not a good arrangement. He never had anybody who was really good on that ranch at first. And then the Dust Bowl came along, but I should, instead of saying when he put it, for a while it was a working ranch. And we had 12 cowboys. And when we'd go up there, the cowboys, a mother would sometimes feed them, and they would come up and eat in the kitchen, where we had a long board table with benches on either side of it. And the cowboys could there. Well, they did some small chores for us, like milking the cows and so on and so forth. But for a while it was a working ranch. And one year we had a drought so bad that Daddy had to drive the cattle to Nebraska for grass. And then he put sheep on them, thinking maybe that would do it. But the lambs were born early, and we had a late freeze, and the lambs all died. So the sheep experience was not a good experience.
When you moved, when Great-Grandpa Morgan bought the ranch, what was there?
Oh, the 3 big houses, 3 big barns, an old wooden windmill, and we had a great big water tower like the railroads used, and back in the early days. But we also used that for a spring house, because that water tower would fill up and it leaked. And but not much, but it would leak, drip just enough water so that the spring house was always cool. And that's where my mother kept eggs and her fresh food, if she could, vegetables and things. And it was the only refrigerator we had, because there were no electric lights, no plumbing, and no running water. Mother had to haul water. She also cooked on a big iron stove that used both coal and wood. She made the most wonderful biscuits I ever ate in my life on that stove. And John, I remember one day John was rolling a piece of lead around that stove, and it rolled off the stove and rolled down inside of his boot, and one of his boots, and it took everybody in the family to get those boots off of him at night. And here he was with this hot lead on top of his foot. And of course, we were trying to get it off, but we also got tickled because he was making so much racket. And I can't remember. I don't think we had to cut those boots off, and I hope not, because they were custom-made boots. Well, the reason it took so long to drive from Wichita Falls is that back in the early 1920s, a lot of the roads were not paved, and those that were paved were narrow, two-lane concrete highways, and maybe there'd be 11 miles of paving, and then it would go back to dirt again. And especially up in the Panhandle, I think all of the roads were still dirt roads back in those days. And we would get to Texline and then we had 3 miles of gravel road, I guess, or dirt road, and then we hit the what we call cowpath trail, which were just 2 tracks of where the tires of the car went. Well, when we got to the edge of our ranch, we had several very, very difficult barbed wire fences. And somebody had to get out and open up that fence, drive the car through, and then get out and close it up again so the cattle wouldn't get out. We didn't have any cattle guards like they have now. And those barbed wire fences were very difficult. The introduction of fenced in the big ranches and also fixed in the homesteaders that came up to farm. It enabled them to have their farms, but building the fences eased the life of the ranchers in a way because the cattle couldn't drift for the roundups. And so that was why but on the other hand, in the wintertime, if we had a blizzard, the cattle would drift up against that fence sometime, and they would just keep on piling up until it would kill them. They would smother to death. So it was a mixed blessing, the barbed wire fence was. They'd have to have big cattle drives in the fall, and which we had anyway, because cattle they'd get around those fences and get mixed up with your neighbors. So in the fall, we'd have what we have a roundup and separate the cattle and castrate the steers, brand, and it was a very exciting time. And we had an old chuck wagon that hired somebody to come out there and cook for all the people who came on this roundup.
How many cowboys at a time would you have working at the ranch?
I don't recall that we ever had any more than 12 working there. We may have had more, but I just remember 12.
And how many head of cattle did Grandpa Morgan have at the peak?
I have no idea how many head he had, to tell you the truth.
Did he ever have any successful years?
I doubt it. I don't know. He may have, but I know that every time my mother wanted anything, new furniture or anything, he always said, "You can't have it right now because I've got a payment on the ranch coming up."
So, go ahead.
It was ironic that there was so much oil and gas in the state of Texas, and as far as I know, up until that time, no oil and gas ever was discovered in Dallam County. Now later on, CO2 was discovered on there, and they began to make dry ice out of the CO2. But there was never any oil and gas discovered in that part of the state. And so Daddy did lease the ranch for the oil and gas companies to look for it, which helped pay the taxes at least. But when 1936, we continued to go to the ranch every summer until we moved to Amarillo, and we didn't have to get away from that Wichita Falls heat. And it must have been very hard on Mother, although I never heard her complain. And she did such things as we had a great big galvanized tub that she'd bathe us in on Saturday night. And she washed her feet the rest of the time, I think, so she didn't have to bathe us, but she bathed us in that great big tub, and she had to heat the water on the stove, pour it in the tub, and then she had to bail it out because it'd be too heavy to lift. And she'd have to bail that tub out. She always bathed us in the kitchen. And she always made wonderful homemade cottage cheese. She'd take that fresh milk that wasn't pasteurized and put it out, and overnight it would what we call clabber. She'd skim the cream off to make butter, and she'd take the rest of it and put it in a sugar sack. Sugar came in sacks in those days, and she'd hang that sack out on the clothesline and let it drip out, and it would end up with wonderful homemade cottage cheese. But we also had a great big old churn that was about 2.5 feet crock churn that had a stick in the middle of it, and she'd put that cream in there, and it was one of my jobs was to churn. And I'd push that stick up and down and up and down and up and down. It seemed to me forever before we would make butter, before it would make butter. But then we made the butter, and then we had wonderful homemade buttermilk left over. Well, another one of the jobs that I had every morning was to clean the lampshades from the coal oil lamps. And remember, I was 6 or 7 years old when I was doing that, but that was one of my jobs. And then as for entertainment, she taught me how to cross stitch, and I cross stitched tea towels or dishcloths out of flour sacks. Flour came in big sacks back in those days too, and Mother would buy 50 pounds at a time, and we'd have the sacks left over. And so I made flour sacks.
What else did you do? You mentioned a couple other things you would do, such as the dolls, paper dolls, and what kind of toys did you have back then, if any?
I don't recall that we had many toys up on the ranch, but I did entertain myself by cutting up Sears and Roebuck catalogs and Montgomery Ward catalogs and make paper dolls. And I would have whole houses with the furniture, and I'd have the dolls, and I'd have the clothes, and I'd have all kinds of things. And those that weren't usable for paper dolls, sometimes those catalogs were taken out and put in the privy and used for toilet paper. And we also had a box of corn cobs out there. Whoever used corn cobs in the privy, I can't imagine. But that box was there. I don't ever remember using any corn cobs in the privy, but I do remember using sheets out of the Montgomery Ward catalog or the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And I also entertained myself. We had a roundup record player that played old Edison phone records. Those Edison phone records were about 1/4 of an inch long, deep rather, and you'd have to turn the needle to play them. And that record player would play regular 75 RPMs records, or those Edison phone. And I remember trying to sing along with Gully Curci, who was the Maria Callas of the day, and a wonderful Italian soprano who sang with the opera, Metropolitan Opera, and also toured the country and made records. Red Label Victor Records, I remember. Those were special records. And then some of our regular records were the wreck of the old 97, which was one about the wreck of a night at the train, and Casey Jones, and If I Had the Wings of, the Prisoner's song, which was If I Had the Wings of an Angel, over these prison walls I would fly. I would fly to the arms of my poor darling, and there I'd be willing to die. And those are the ones I'd stand up on a box, and that old record player had to be wound up. And as it went farther along the record, sometimes it would get slower and slower and slower until you couldn't even understand what they were saying or what they were singing. But that would take up quite a bit of time.
Now, what you mentioned that you like to play with the paper dolls. What did Sally enjoy that activity, or what did Sally do, as you remember, when she was out there? What did she like to do?
Oh, that's the funny thing about my sister Sally. We were not close as children. And I don't remember Sally. I don't remember ever playing with Sally. I know that Sally made fun of me because I like to play dress up, and I like to do some of the things. Sally she liked to draw and paint and do things like that, and to tell you the truth, I don't know what she did. I guess she read, because she learned how to read when she was 5 years old. And but Sally and I never really played together.
What about you've mentioned on some of the earlier tapes Uncle Sam's mischief and Uncle John, but what did the two boys do when they were out there?
Well,
for fun?
John was an early day cowboy. I remember somebody told me one time, and I cannot remember that woman's name, and it makes me very sad, because she said John would go up to their ranch, which adjoined ours, early before we went. And she said, I always had a terrible time getting John to take a bath and clean up before your mother and daddy came up there. But John he was 7 years old when we first started going up there, and the cowboys, he learned how to drive on that ranch when he was 7 years old. And he also learned how to smoke, because he hung out with the cowboys and they taught him to smoke. And they rolled their own, but John knew how to do it. And as I talked about a while ago, rolling the lead around, he had to wear custom-made cowboy boots because his arch was so high they couldn't buy cowboy boots that he could get on. And John rode, and he got thrown and was dragged one time and really banged up. And also he was a headache around the house, because Mother would try to take help up there, and John would do such things as find a harmless snake, of course, and put it in the drawer with the silverware. Well, after putting up with that for a little while, the help always wanted to go back to Wichita Falls. Besides that, they were lonesome up there. And that would be to jump back on something. When we were driving up there, we had colored help. We called them colored help back in those days. And I remember driving through Claude one night, and there was a sign on the edge of Claude that said, "Nigger, don't let the sun set on your head in this town tonight." And they would sit in the back seat with us and say, "Oh, Mr. Morgan, hurry up and get through this town." So those were back in the Jim Crow days. Very sad.
Now, so when you said that John had learned to drive, do you mean drive a car or drive?
He learned how to drive a car when he was 7 years old on that ranch.
But he was also working with the men.
Oh, he would go out and ride. He had his own little horse, and he'd go out and work with. He hung out with the cowboys even until, especially by the time we quit going up there, he was, 10 or 12 years old. So we went up there we quit going up there in 1926.
And what was the year that Grandpa Morgan bought the place?
He bought it in 1920.
And when did he end up selling it?
He sold the ranch in 1943 when a man named C.D. Schamberger, but I'll go back and say why he sold the ranch. The ranch in 1936, I guess, 1930, the Dust Bowls started. 1930, around in there, 33, 34, the Dust Bowls started. And that ranch sat there for 9 years with nothing on it. And the dust blew up to the second-story windows in the big house. And the fence posts were covered. You could just see the top of the fence post with the dust and the tumbleweeds, and it was just terrible. But it sat there all those years with nothing on it. Well, back in the early 40s, I think it was 1940, I believe he sold that ranch in 1943. By the late 1941s, Daddy had a good man from Claude who had lost his own ranch because of the Dust Bowl and the Depression, but was a rancher. Mr. Dokes came up and leased that ranch. And they went in and they painted up, as I say, used bulldozers to pull the dust out. He painted those houses yellow. They put in a Delco system, so they had electric lights. Mr. Dokes was running 1,000 head of cattle, and the grass had come back. David Rasco and I drove up there, and the grass had come back until that buffalo native grass was knee-high, different places. So for the first time in the history of that ranch, Daddy had an opportunity to maybe make some money out of it and make it a running operation. But he got a letter from a man, a real estate agent in Wichita Falls, from a man named C.D. Schamberger, who was going up in that part of the world and buying up all those ranches. And Daddy, I have the letters that he wrote to his brother, saying that thought he was going to sell the ranch, and talking about the various offers. And he finally got one for $8 an acre, and the mineral rights. Well, of course, he didn't get to keep there were no minerals, as it turned out. But we were living in New York City at the time, and I remember Mother saying, "Daddy, don't sell that ranch. Please don't sell it. You've got good people on it for the first time, and don't sell it." And he said, "Well, this is the first opportunity I've had to get rid of it." And he said, "I don't think I could go through 9 or 10 more years of dust and drought. So I'm going to sell it to C.D. Schamberger." Well, C.D. Schamberger went in there and bought a lot of those ranches at that same time. And one of them he bought, that he didn't buy, was a man named R.L. McMurtry down the road who sold his ranch a little later on for $3.5 million. Well, just last year, C.D. Schamberger's heirs, by this time there were so many heirs, decided they would get rid of that ranch. And they sold the ranch, including the part of the ranch we had, for $250 an acre. The Buffalo Springs ranch, 500 acres of that, sold to a man who was really getting Alzheimer's for over $5,000. And he planned to...
$5,000 an acre, right?
$5,000 an acre. He planned to restore that ranch to the historic way it was when it was the head of the XIT, and deed it to A&M. Well, he got in over his head, but he also died. and they had to sell that property, and I don't know what they sold it for, but they had to take a big loss because nobody was going to pay $5,000 an acre just because it was a historic headquarters of the XIT. So our summers at the ranch were really wonderful, fun summers. Sam always had a host of friends who were over there all the time, and I remember M.T. Johnson was a very close friend to Sam's, as was Bob Izzard, as was Alan Ritter, and Avery Rush Jr., and Grady Howard. But our house was always full of kids. My mother let us entertain, and we sometimes have as many as 20 kids spending the night over there. And she never complained, and there was just, she always let us have all the little club parties and the club dances. And so Sam always had he was too young to dance when we did that, because when Sam was 13, my father decided that the coming place for the oil and gas law business, as far as the legal business was concerned, was going to be Houston. So he, that year though, my sister Sally, what precipitated this, my sister Sally was a senior at the University of Southern California, and she announced at Christmas time, Sally was a rebel. She announced at Christmas time that she was going to quit school if she didn't have her own apartment. Well, back in those days, nobody had their own girls did not have their own apartment at college like they do now, and frequent kids have their own apartments all the time now, but back in those days they either lived in the sorority house or the dormitories. Well, Daddy was contemplating moving to Houston. He was thinking about it. So he told Sally, he said, all right, you can have your own apartment in California, but you'll have to take your mother and Sam with you. So they went to California. By this time, I was in Stevens College. Mother and Sally and Sam went out to California, so Sally would finish school out there. And then she was, for graduation, Daddy sent her and sent my mother and Sally to the Fiji Islands to visit his sister, Aunt Johnny, who was living down there by that time. And Sam and I went to Chile Camp. Well, the next year, by that time, Daddy had decided he was going to move to Houston, which he did. And came home, when my mother came home, they very rapidly packed everything up and put it in storage, because by this time he had gotten a big lawsuit that was going to be tried for Texaco, which was going to be tried in Madison, Wisconsin. And Daddy anticipated being away from Texas and Houston for 3 months. But as it turned out, as things happened, he was away 20 years before he came back. Well, Sam, I was at Stevens, and so Sam, Daddy and Mother decided the best place for Sam to go was to Kemper Military School, which was in Boonville, Missouri, just 30 miles from Stevens. And this was 1937, when he went to Kemper. Well, Sam was not a military school student, and one of the things he did, he got first trouble he got in was for putting toothpaste on the door handles of the kids one night in the middle of the night. So he got to walk some tours for that. And incidentally, I went over there to see him one night, and there were 12 boys walking tours, and 9 of them happened to be from Amarillo. So Kemper had a lot of Amarillo students, as did New Mexico Military Institute. But one night Sam decided that he was going to run away. And he was 13 years old, so he ran away, and he got on the edge of town, and some man recognized his uniform and picked him up and asked him what he was going to do, and he said, well, he was going to run away. And the man said, well, where are you going to go? And he said, well, I don't know. My folks are living in Evanston, Illinois right now, and I guess I'll go up there. And the man said, well, Sam, you can't, there's no way you can get to Evanston, Illinois in the middle of the night, and I suggest that you go back to Kemper and tell him what you've done, and let them see if they'll take you back instead of expelling you, because they might decide to expel you. Well, they went back, and one of the nutty officers decided, he said, Sam, what were you out doing out there? And he said, were you out looking for a whore? And Sam, not knowing what a whore was, said, well, yes, I guess I was. So, but at any rate, he stayed at Kemper 2 years, and then by that time, my parents decided to let him come back and go to a school in Lake Forest called Lake Forest Academy. And Sam went to Lake Forest Academy until he graduated, and then he went to Northwestern. And by this time, the war had come along, and also Sam had met his bride-to-be, who was also at Northwestern, Marjorie Morgan. Well, Sam was at Northwestern, and then he was in the V-12 program, which was a Navy Reserve program in school. And he finally got out of Northwestern. I think he graduated from Northwestern. He was far enough along before he got to go to midshipman school in New York City. And he had a terrible time. Sam had bad tonsils, so he began to get arthritis up there while he was in midshipman school. And he was in the hospital a lot, and they were about to flunk him out, I think, of midshipman school. And the man who stood up for him and made them talk was a Christian Science reader, bless my heart. But he managed to help Sam keep. So when the graduation ceremony came along, which was held at St. John's Cathedral in New York City, lo and behold, Sam was presented with the sword as the cadet who had made the most progress while he was in midshipman school. And I heard Sam laughing, and he said, oh my Lord. He said, when I look at how bad I was when I got out, what must I have been when I started out? So, but he did go in the Navy, and in the meantime, right after he graduated, he and Marjorie got married, and he was almost immediately, they went out to San Francisco, and he got pneumonia, and he was sick their honeymoon. He was sick on their honeymoon. Then he was sent to the South Pacific, where he was on I think it was a landing ship. The ships that went up, and they lowered out their what do you call their ramp for soldiers to land on the invasions. So he was in the South Pacific for quite a while. Then he came home and got a job with, I believe it was Pillsbury. And I have one of his stories that he wrote in there. One of his jobs was they called Sam the Chicken Man, because Sam went out with a troop of trained chickens to all the county fairs and things. And he had these chickens were trained to do all kinds of things. They played poker. They played the piano. They danced. They did all kinds of things. And the way the chickens were trained, nobody could beat them at this poker because, Sam, they had marked cards that people couldn't see, but those chickens could spot that spot on the card, and if they went over and pecked that card, that particular card, they would end up with straights and full houses and all kinds of things. And every time they did, they'd get fed. And the same thing was true of their piano playing and the other things that they did. Well,